Hey, so we're in chapter 43 of Genesis this morning. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. And we've come a long ways in Genesis, right? I remember when Scott and I were first talking about starting to go through Genesis, he's like, I think I'll go through the first 12 chapters, and then we'll go do something else. Because it's a big book, and there's 50 chapters, and I mean, that's going to take a long time to get through, right? And it does. It does take a long time to get through. But if you get to chapter 12, the story's kind of just getting fired up, right? So there's a lot happens in those first 11 chapters. We have, all the big, the Sunday school stories and stuff with the flood and creation and Babel and giants and all those things that happen and things. But when we get to chapter 12, we're introduced to this family, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 12. And we see Abram, who's changed to Abraham, is called. And we see that he's given these promises, these blessings, these things, this covenant that God made with him. And from chapter 12 on is this playing out. And when I say chapter 12 on, I say chapter 12 on even past Genesis, is the playing out of these promises that God made to Abraham, this covenant that God made with Abraham, and these promises that he made of, if you remember, there was land and people and offspring and blessing, all those things. And we see this playing out in these chapters. And a lot of these, and as Scott said last week, a lot of these are just narratives, right? They're just stories. Like when we read these, we read these different than we would like a New Testament epistle, right? When I read Paul, he's telling me, don't do this and do this. He tells me things like, this is what God is like and this is what God is not like, right? He's very specific. But we read in the Old Testament, this is telling the story about God's people. And so we read it a little bit differently, but those things that we learn about God that are confirmed in the New Testament, we see those all the way through the Old Testament and through these passages, like this passage we're going to look at today. All right? And this story we're going to look at today is another story about this guy named Joseph. And we see that Joseph, we've learned a lot about him in the last few weeks because of this life of this guy. Joseph started out kind of rough. He was a son of Israel, if you remember, and he was his favorite son. And he gave him this beautiful coat, and he favored him. He gave him all the best things, and his brothers hated him. And if you remember the story, he was sold. They were going to kill him. They decided, we're going to be merciful to him, and we're going to just sell him into slavery. And he ends up in Egypt, and we see the providence of God working through this, the life of Joseph, and this fact that this kid that had everything going for him, had his father's blessing, had the best of everything, went from that to being zero to being a prisoner in Egypt. And yet, through the sovereignty of God and the plan that God had for Joseph's life, none of those situations that he went into, none of those roadblocks could stop what God had for Joseph. Oh yeah, they tried. Remember, he was thrown in prison. He was accused of adultery. He was almost killed several times, and we see that even in this place, that today when we're here, that he is the second in command in Egypt over all of this, and in this time and with this famine, his power goes far from Egypt as well, right? The whole world is coming to Joseph because they're hungry and because they can't take care of themselves, and they're coming they're coming to Joseph and looking for him for answers in their life. He is much more than just the second in charge in Egypt. Really, the whole world is coming to him, around him. Sometimes when we look at the sovereignty of God, and when people talk about sovereignty and they talk about providence, we think that we look at it in the negative as cruel, and that we take away people's choices in their lives, or God has his thumb on people and makes them do what he wants them to do. And sometimes that light is shown on when we look at God in that way. And we say, well, what if Joseph didn't want to do all this? But what I hope you see today in this passage is not just this all-powerful God that has got his thumb on people and is doing wrong to people, but we see the mercy of God displayed, the grace of God in his sovereignty, in his providence. We see the mercy of God as well. And that's the beautiful thing about the God we serve, right? He's not this big hammer in heaven, but he's a merciful, gracious God. Yes, he's sovereign. Yes, he's powerful. All those things. He's marvelous, and like we just sang, but he is also a God of mercy and a God of grace, and he shows that grace in abundance to the people that he loves and to the people that he's called to his purpose. And so when we read just a narrative that it seems like another Bible story to you this morning out of Genesis, I want you to remember, what are we learning about God through these people? And if you'll remember Joseph as well, when we look at Joseph's life, many commentators and theologians look at Joseph's life as a type of what Christ would be in the future. This Savior theme that we see in the Old Testament through him, it's not exactly Christ, right? But we see these pictures of what Christ did for us in the story of Joseph as well. So in Genesis chapter 43, let's start in verse 1. It says this, and now you remember the previous story about Joseph is that they all went down to Egypt, him and all of his brothers, all of Joseph's brothers left Canaan and went to Egypt, and they left Benjamin at home because that was a lot of names in here, because Jacob or Israel is showing favoritism. Well, he had lost Joseph, right? But his favorite is now Benjamin and kept him because he was his youngest and all these things. They went there and Joseph meets them and says, hey, he accuses them of being spies and all these things and says, yeah, you guys got to prove this to me that you're not spies, that you're not doing me wrong. And he says, and how you're going to prove that is you're going to leave Simeon here. I'm going to keep him in jail. And you're going to go home and you're going to bring back Benjamin to me. And then I will know you're not spies. I'll know you that you're honest men. And then I will release him to you. And so they went back and they told their father all this stuff, and he was grieved about all these things. And what's interesting, though, is that this poor Simeon guy, I don't know how he got the right of the deal. It says this, we start here, it says, now the famine was severe in the land, and when they had eaten the grain that they had bought from Egypt, their father said to them, go again, buy us a little food. And when I read that this week, and I said, wait a minute. They went all the way to Egypt. Simeon was left there. They went all the way back to Canaan and stayed there until they had eaten all the grain that they had bought in Egypt. They never went back and got him. I don't know, I felt a little compassion, I feel for Simeon. He's sitting in a jail in Egypt. But it says that they had gone back, and they didn't hurry back. He was grieved about losing another son, but not grieved enough to go do anything about it because he loved Benjamin so much. It says, but Judah said to him, the man solemnly warned us, saying, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with us. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. And Israel said, why do you treat me so badly as to tell the man that you had another brother? And they replied, the man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our kindred, saying, is your father still alive? And do you have another brother? But we told him was the answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, bring your brother down? And Judah said to Israel his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die. But we and you and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. For my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would have now returned twice. And so he calls out his father and said, this is what happened there. This is why we can't go back. But if we're going to go, let's go. I'll take responsibility for this. Let's don't delay any longer. He says that this agreement that they had made with this guy, this unknown person at this point in Egypt, he said, we've got to take Benjamin back with us. And Israel, Jacob, doesn't want to do it, and he's very grieved about this, but he says, okay, let's go ahead. Go back. But he says, why did you go and tell them? And he says, this guy, and you see them starting to figure this thing out, right? They see him trying to figure out, like, how did this guy know so much about us? How did he know to ask questions about our father and about our brothers and things? And Judah's just explaining, he goes, this guy asked these deep questions, and we were afraid for our lives, and we had to tell him. And we see that Jacob agrees to let him go. He agrees to let them go and take his last son, his youngest son, his favorite son with them back to Egypt because they're desperate. There's no food in Canaan. Is it better to lose a son that he loves so much or to lose his whole family? And we see the desperation that's in this family right now. We see that they have nowhere else to go. Verse 11 says, and their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man, a little balm, a little honey, gum, and myrrh, and pistachio nuts and almonds. And take double the money with you and carry it back with you. The money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks, perhaps it was an oversight. Take also your brother and arise and go again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send you your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. So the men took his present, and they took double the money with them in Benjamin. They arose and went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. And I wanted you to see this in this passage. If you remember back in Genesis 37, I'm going to go back there right now in chapter 37, verse 25. And if you remember when Joseph was sold into slavery, we see this where he had these dreams and his brothers were angry with him, you remember? And he said, I had this dream and my sheaves were bowing, I was standing there and all these other ones were bowing down to me, and then the sun, the moon, and the stars, and even his father said, are you saying that your mother and I are going to bow down to you as well? And he said, well, yeah, that's what it said. But his brothers were angry with him, and when they went to sell him into slavery, they were going to kill him. And listen to this, what was there. And when I see this, it's a little bit of irony, but it's a little bit of a jab, I think. And because Jacob is saying, go to them and bring this gift to this unknown man. Bring this gift of these things that we do have. We don't have grain, but we have these things. Prepare this gift and bring it to it. And in chapter 37, verse 25, it says, and this is after they had plotted to kill him, and it says they sat down to eat, and in looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. And so they saw these people and with their camels, and it says, went bearing with them gum and balm and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Can you imagine the brothers standing there in that place and their father saying, hey, go to Egypt and get my son back, get us grain to eat. And you can imagine them saying, remember that day when we sold our brother? And the men that we met on that trail and what they were saying, and his dad is saying, prepare this gift that's exactly the same as those people that you sold him to and that you sold him into slavery. And you can imagine them thinking through this as brothers and seeing the guilt that they had and thinking that the reminder of what they had done to their brother. And later on, you can imagine when this gift is spread out before Joseph in Egypt. You can imagine the feelings it would bring because he was sold to those people. And he was sold as property just like this gift was. Joseph was no better than any of these products that they were selling. He was just another commodity. And imagine the weight that is on these brothers. In verse 6, go back to chapter 43, and it says this in verse 16, as we continue going through this chapter. It says, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, bring the men into this house and slaughter an animal and make ready for the men to dine with me at noon. So they're getting there, and Joseph sees them coming again. He says, prepare a meal for these men. The man did as Joseph told him and brought him to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, is it because of the money which was replaced in our sacks the first time that we were brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us to make us servants and seize our donkeys? You remember when they came the last time, they had bought all this grain, and Joseph had commanded them to put the money back in their sacks and gave them to them for free, and they were afraid for their lives. It was like, because someone's going to think we stole this. And so they're thinking this as they go in, and they're afraid for their lives. So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the door in the house. And listen to this, it says, and said, "O my Lord, we came down the first time to buy food. And when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of the sack. Our money is in full weight, so we have brought it again with us." And they're begging for forgiveness. They're saying, we didn't do this. This ended up in our bag. And look at what the response is of Joseph's servant to them. And he says, "Peace to you, and don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in your sacks for you, and I received your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. When I see this happen, this guy, I don't know who this guy is. This is one of Joseph's hands that is meeting him out there and speaking to these guys. And yet, we see Joseph's effect on the people around him here. When I see a man that is just another Egyptian, that is a servant, that is just doing his job and goes out, and his answer to these people is, hey man, I got paid the money that I was given. Your God and the God of your father has blessed you. Even this servant understood that there was something special about these guys and that their God was blessing them even in the midst of a famine, in the midst of a scary situation, going into a place where their life was in danger, that God was blessing them. He says, peace to you. Have peace in this situation. I was paid. That must have been your God that was blessing you. And again, you can imagine how these guys felt. Yes, they felt peace because their life was no longer in danger, but the weight of the guilt that they had of the reason they were even there. The thought of their brother, the thought of this gift they had brought, the thought of losing another one, the guilt that they have must have been heavy. And when the man had brought to them into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder, they prepared the present for Joseph's coming soon, for they had heard that they should eat bread there. And so they they go to this place, they get washed up, they feed their animals, and they spread out this gift, and they wait for, it says they wait for Joseph, but you remember, they don't know it's Joseph. They're waiting for the man that has their life in his hand. And it says, when Joseph came home, they brought into the house of him the present that they had with them, and bowed down to him in the ground. If you remember, back in Joseph's dreams, it said that he bowed down to them 3 times. He had bowed down to them once before, and again, they come into his presence, and he bowed down before this guy again. And these prophecies, unknown to them, but well known to Joseph, right, at this time, that they are fulfilling this prophecy, this dream that was given to Joseph. And what a weird way for that to turn out. The fact that they would use that God, and we see, again, if we step back a little bit from this and we see the sovereignty of God, if you had heard a story about a dream about 12 brothers and 11 of them would bow down to the other one, you would not think it would be accomplished by this foreign, evil, pagan country that would give that one brother the power, the only way he could have the power for his other brothers to bow down to him. But we see that God, in his bigger purposes than even of this family, his universal purposes, his plan for these promises that he had made to this family, those brothers knew those promises. They knew about their great-grandpa Abraham, right? And they knew about these generational promises, and they had been repeated to their fathers and all of these things, but they only looked at their family, right? We do the same thing. We get a narrow focus. We get this tunnel vision of we can't see anything else but the problems that are right before us. We see that in this case, that they're starving and their lives are in danger and they can't see outside of this thing. But unbeknownst to them, they had no clue what was going on, that they were in the hand of God right where they were at. They were in a foreign country with people that didn't know them, but one did. They had no idea, but they were playing out the plan of God, God's sovereign plan for redemption, not only for this family, but for generations after this family. They came and they bowed down before their brother, not knowing it was him. Not because Joseph's an awesome guy, or not because they did the right thing, but because God is big. And he's bigger than all of their plans and all the things that they could come up with. And he inquired about their welfare and said, this is verse 27, "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they said, "Your servant, your father is well, he's still alive." And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves, and then he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." And then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. The number 2 guy in Egypt at the sight of his family, at the sight of his brothers bowing down to him, and at his little brother that he loved so much, that was so special to him, the most powerful man around, ran out of the room and found a place where he could weep because he couldn't do that in front of anybody else. It said that his emotions welled up at him and consumed him in this. The Greek word for compassion, the Hebrew word for compassion in there has this, it has a lot to do with it. It talks about your bowels, right? And it's this graphic word, but have you ever had that emotion where it's just in your feeling and you almost want to puke? You ever been that emotional? Happy or sad, I might add, right? Have you ever been just so emotional and so overcome with emotion that your stomach's in a knot? You guys know what that feels like. And you can imagine him and his pride and the position that he was in and the responsibility that he had. He had to get out of that room, and he went and wept because of what was going on. It says he washed his face and he came out and controlling himself. So he wiped the tears from his face and said, you can imagine looking in the mirror, okay, Joseph, pull it together. Washed his face and came out and controlling himself. He says, serve the food, and they served by himself. And then by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that was an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. And it says that portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as all of theirs. And they drank and they were merry with him. And it says that they had this meal with their brother, still not knowing, and they were blessed by this man in Egypt. And as we began this, I said I wanted to point out the providence and the sovereignty of God, but also the mercy of God. And we see that all the way through this passage. We see the mercy of God in places where it wouldn't normally see it in a passage like this. We see them showing up. Remember, they thought they were going to get in trouble for all that money, and God had taken care of that because he had touched that servant and said, hey, it must have been your God that gave you that money because I received my payment. And we see them go into the presence of Joseph even, and they lay down this gift before him, and they go before him, and they bow down to him, and they beg for his mercy. And they were given mercy. Joseph had every right and his position of power and his relationship to these men that came before him to take vengeance on these men in this situation. Do you guys realize that? He could have wiped these people. He could have ended this family right here, and it would have just been Joseph left. And he would have, in the time and in the place, it was probably justified. Do you see how we, when we go in the presence of God, are that same way? That God's wrath and his judgment is righteous, and we deserve that. And yet, just like in the story of Joseph, when he looks at them and he has compassion on them, it says that his compassion grew. In the same way, God looks at us with compassion. And as I studied this passage and I listened to some guys talking about this, I'm not a Hebrew scholar at all, right? I use Google just like everybody else, right? But one of the most interesting things is in this passage, if you look in verse 30, it says, then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother. In the English, it's lost, but that word for compassion is the same as in verse 14, when Jacob is praying for his sons, when he says, may God Almighty grant you mercy before this man. Jacob went to his God and said, I'm sending my sons to their death right now. And I pray that this man will have mercy on these people. And it says that his compassion, his mercy grew so much for these people that he had to leave, and he showed that mercy. That mercy, we don't think of mercy as a feeling, right? But it is that. It's that compassion for these people. It was so great. And it was an answer to prayer from Jacob, but it was also God moving in the heart of Joseph. Have you ever know anybody that's hard to forgive? Maybe you have someone in your life right now that has hurt you, and they don't deserve your forgiveness, right? I don't like to talk about this a whole lot, but a story about my dad. Me and my dad are fine now, so it's got a happy ending. But when I was in high school, my dad wasn't around, and I was working at Larry's Chevron in Nampa, Idaho. And as I was working there, it was about 10:30 at night. I closed that shop at 11, and I was just hanging out doing my thing. And my brother walks in, and my dad walks in behind him. And I hadn't seen my dad in years and years. And he walks into where I'm working. And I look at him, and I look at my brother. I'm like, what are you doing here? Like, there's a time and a place, right? I'm at work, and I'm doing these things. And I go, hey, guys, you guys just need to go, and I'll talk to you afterwards. And so I closed up. I finished my job, and I went and talked to my dad. I went to my brother's house. He had this small house, and I walked in. And at the time, I was a heavyweight wrestler. I was in really good shape. I had my Letterman's jacket on. I was 6'4", and I walk into this living room with my dad, and it was one of the most awkward things in the world, because I had all these feelings, and I told my dad, this is one of the first conversations I had with my dad, is I go, I don't know whether to punch you right now or to give you a hug, and I don't know how to deal with that feeling. I don't know what to do with this. And he's like, well, you should probably sit down. And I talked to him later. He was a little scared that I was going to choose the first one. and I remember he said, hey, Brent, why don't you just sit down for a while and let's talk this out. And I found out all these things, that my brother had been talking to him and had a relationship with him and all these things. And it was kind of off and on, and he left again. And it was years later that we finally got back in touch. And Alicia and I, right after we were married, went on a road trip, and we ended up staying with him in Washington. Hadn't seen him in years, and we said, hey, we want to come up and see you. And my dad took me out afterward. He took me out for a beer afterward. We went to this little seedy place in Oregon. And he talked to me, and he said, Brent, I need you to get anything off your chest that you need to say, anything you've never been able to say to me. This is the time, and we need to put this stuff behind us. And through the grace of God, not because Brent's a strong guy, because he's not, by the grace of God and through prayer and what God had taught me, in that moment, I looked at my dad and I said, there's nothing more. I've forgiven you of everything, and there's nothing that you can ever do to make up for that, but there's also nothing else that you can do to gain from me. It's because of what God has done in my life that I forgive you, and we're starting over. I'm not strong enough for that, guys. I wanted to be mad at him. I wanted to hurt him. But God stepped into my life and forgave me of so much. And he showed mercy on me. And when I read the Bible, and when I learned about who God was, and I read stories like this, I learned that God was he was a big God and a sovereign God, but he was also a God of love and a God of grace and a God of forgiveness and a God of mercy. And God had shown me so much that how could I stand before a man that really hadn't done much? He just wasn't around, right? How could I stand before him in all my hurt and say, no, I've been forgiven of all this, but I'm never going to forgive you because you've hurt me too much and you don't deserve it. And I have every right to be mad at you. I have every right to have vengeance on you. No. God had done so much in my life. God had done so much for me that in that moment, I could do nothing but forgive that man. Me and my dad have it's a different relationship, right? But I love my dad. And I could call him and I could talk to him. And from that day forward, we worked on that, right? But it was because God had forgiven me much. And when I think about this, I think about Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 2, it says this. And it really encompasses what was going on with Joseph and his family. And it speaks to me in my life of what I've been through. And it says this, it says, you were dead in your trespasses and sin in which you once walked. This is Ephesians 2. Following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. He says, this is Paul talking to them and saying, we all lived that way. Because I'm talking to you because I lived that way too. caring about the desires of the body and the mind, and we're by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. He says we deserve the wrath of God. We deserve the judgment of God on us. And verse 4 says this, and it's that game-changing moment in Joseph and his brother's life when they bowed down before him, and that compassion and that mercy welled up in him so much that he had to leave. It says, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. It says, by grace you have been saved. And when we read that passage, a lot of times we don't think about the Old Testament God because we think about him and his wrath and his sovereignty and his power and all of those things. But God is the same as he is today, tomorrow, and the same as he was yesterday in the Old Testament as well. And we see the mercy and grace of God in that passage toward those people. Not only his mercy and his grace on the brothers of Joseph, but if you remember the bigger plan of God. The promises that he made to Abram and his family carried on to you who are sitting in this pew today, in these chairs today. We're not in pews, we're a Baptist church, but it's still chairs. Old habits. That mercy that he showed to this family, you know why he showed them mercy? Because he wanted to show mercy to you as well. Because God carries out. We're going to, spoiler alert, when we go through the rest of Genesis, and if you read through the rest of the Old Testament, God carries out his promises exactly like he said he would, and he uses people that you never thought he would, and eventually this guy Jesus shows up, and it said in here, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love he had for us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together in Christ. The fulfillment of those promises that he made. And if we read the Old Testament and don't put it in the context of what God has done for us, we miss these things in those passages. But God, because he was so rich in mercy, loved us. And while we were yet sinners, he saved us. Jesus died for us. Not because he had to, because he wanted to and because he loved us so much. Thank God for his mercy and his grace in our lives and where he's brought us. And thank God for these stories in the Old Testament that show us the greatness, the bigness of God, but also his mercy and his compassion and his love for us as well.